Fantastic Mr. Fox is a 2009 Wes Anderson film based around the family life of, well, it's about Mr. Fox, I mean it's in the title. Taking quite a departure from the original book, Fantastic Mr. Fox the movie still has the struggle against Boggis, Bunce and Bean, though the film is centred around different themes from Roald Dahl's original work. There's a clear character study of this Mr. Fox as he goes through a midlife crisis, struggles with his masculinity and reputation as the fantastic Mr. Fox, and he must put aside his own needs as a wild animal to become the head of the table all the little woodland creatures need him to be. For many, this is some of Wes Anderson's best works. It combines charming cinematography and animation with some stellar performances, excellent writing and pacing. However, there is one part of the film that even 13 years on has most people baffled. If you don't know what I'm talking about already, haven't seen the film, or didn't read the bloody title, I'm on about the wolf scene. Now, the wolf scene in Fantastic Mr. Fox comes just before the end of the movie, right after Foxy has saved Ash and Christopherson and beaten the forces of Boggis, Bunce and Bean. As this is a PG-rated Wes Anderson film, things were bound to have this decent, cushy ending. Mr. Fox even gets his tail back, as Kylie, Foxy, Ash and Christopherson all ride away to meet up with the rest of the cast. Mr. Fox suddenly stops, as he sees a wolf on a nearby hill. Now, throughout the film, Mr. Fox has constantly had a running gag of being deathly afraid of wolves, something that the rest of the cast find weird, and yet every time the word wolf is even mentioned, Foxy stops dead in his tracks until there's no wolf to be seen. When he actually does see one, again Mr. Fox is brought to a halt, as his fight or flight gives him the rare option of standing still and doing nothing. Mr. Fox, being the brave type of fellow that he is, says hello to the wolf, trying to communicate it in a number of languages. A tear forms in Fox's eye as he continues to watch this wolf, his attempts at speaking having failed, before eventually Mr. Fox just raises his fist as a sort of salute. The wolf mimics the move before leaving the foxes and the possum to their business. Throughout the scene, the score has a very serious, emotional tone, and there's clearly a deeper meaning meant to this seemingly strange scene that appears randomly before the film's resolution. While it gives closure for Mr. Fox to see a wolf after the audience has been informed he's scared of them, it's clear there's more at play than just closure for something mentioned in Act 1 of the film. So, without further ado, let's look at some of the theories people have for the meaning behind the wolf scene. The first and I'd say most widespread theory behind the wolf scene is that the wolf represents true wilderness. Now, due to the fact that this scene seems to have little to no place in the main story, most people find their meaning for the scene in the interaction between Mr. Fox and the wolf, rather than the scene's placement as part of the film. In this series' case though, there's a focus on the lack of interaction between the two in this scene. Mr. Fox acts as a civilized man, mostly attempting to communicate through the languages he knows, and yet the wolf can offer no response. Even in Latin identification, perhaps the oldest and most recognised way of identifying animals, the wolf just stares blankly at Fox and its retinue. This is the first and most important indication that the wolf is a truly wild creature. Two more things tell us about the wolf's wilderness, and those are its lack of clothing, which is something every animal besides the wolf wear in the film, and the fact that the wolf also walks on four legs primarily, lifting only one leg to salute Mr. Fox. Again, most of the other animals in the film use their two legs to walk. There's a looser thing too of the wolf being on a hill of snow, when no other snow is evident in the film, indicating that the animal exists in a time beyond or sort of before civilization. In this evidence, Fantastic Mr. Fox enjoyers point out that the wolf is likely a representation of the wilderness that Mr. Fox has lost. Fantastic Mr. Fox refers to himself throughout the film as a wild animal, and yet he is forced into a civilized life. Killing chickens and escaping farmers is fun for him, but he must put that life away in order to stop himself endangering his family and his community. Fox has a wider responsibility than himself, and this is something that he's struggled with since he's had to give up on his wilder life. In Mr. Fox's interaction with the wolf then, he sees this pure form of wilderness, something that he aspired towards throughout the film, and for him this is one final farewell to the life he used to lead. Even though he tries to keep his old life alive, Mr. Fox cannot fight the change around him, and even in Victory the animals of the woods now have to live in the sewers and steal food from a supermarket. Even as wild animals, the characters of the film end up civilized, whether they're happy about it or not. The wolf acting as wilderness then explains the tear in Foxy's eye as he's letting go of an aspect of himself, yet he will not go back to the wilderness as it would mean giving up his current happy life. Now, I do like the wilderness theory, however it doesn't really explain why Mr. Fox is afraid of wolves for so long. Why would he be afraid of the wild when he constantly believes himself to be a wild animal? Perhaps then, Mr. Fox is intimidated by wolves, rather than being truly afraid of them. This leads us on to our next theory. The second theory identifies the wolf as Mr. Fox's masculine ideal, the thing he subconsciously aspires to be. Now this sort of coincides with the wilderness theory, but instead of the wolf being something Fox abandons, it's something he's always wanted, evidenced by his references to himself as a wild animal and his more violent tendencies shown in the rat fight and dinner scenes. By this theory, Mr. Fox's fear of wolves develops by seeing them as strong, wild, and truly free to raid as many farms as they like without caring about what their wife or family will say. Basically, they're the things Foxy knows he cannot be, but wants to be so badly. In this aspiration, Mr. Fox becomes confused and develops his phobia of wolves. It's a bit like meeting your heroes, you know? Like, say you're a huge Dwayne The Rock fan, you idolise this guy so much that you get nervous even thinking about him, and then someone says, "Oh look, there's Dwayne The Rock Johnson," instead of going, "Oh boy, where?" You just freeze as if meeting this masculine ideal would be too much for you to handle. It is a cool idea that the wolf is everything that Fox wants to be, and meeting it is this existential experience, something that he never would have thought had such an impact, and it can be read more simply as just Mr. Fox being a fanboy for wolves, but this doesn't give the theory enough credit. Having the wolf as an ideal explains Mr. Fox's explanation of his thing with wolves as a phobia rather than a fear. He does even just refer to it as a thing at times, meaning that although Mr. Fox freezes and asks where a wolf is a lot of the time, it doesn't mean he'd just run at the sight of one. Instead, this theory makes Fox's phobia of wolves a subconscious problem with meeting his masculine ideal. Mr. Fox has had this idea throughout the film that he has to be something special in order to feel good about himself, and he believes everything he wants to be resides within a wolf. Therefore, when he sees all his subconscious assumptions are brought to light, and he sees that his ideal is just another creature like him, this fulfills Mr. Fox's character arc as he sees something he's been afraid of and realises that his phobia was unfounded. He becomes his ideal in this final moment. While I do like the masculine ideal theory and the idea that the wolf is the key to Mr. Fox becoming truly fantastic, I think there's another more existential theory worth looking at. This final theory is one I've crafted a bit by myself, and it views the wolf as death rather than a masculine ideal or an ideal of wilderness. This turns Fox's phobia into a more traditional definition of the word, linking it to a fear, as he sees the wolves as the intimidating predator that they are, and something that could kill our dapper old Fox rather easily. Fox's fear of wolves is just another way of saying that despite his want for excitement and adventure, death truly does frighten him. I don't think Foxy fears death by pharma, though as much as he fears death by natural causes. The times we see true fears of Mr. Fox are when he finds out his son is going to be born and that he's growing old. He wants to continue being the young, fantastic Mr. Fox for as long as possible, and struggles with the fact that he can't live an exciting and wealthy life. It is the slow death that scares Mr. Fox most, and that's what makes him begin his robberies of Boggis, Bunt and Bean in the first place. In order to live the life that he wants, Mr. Fox must constantly brush himself against death, and yet rather than acknowledge that he's afraid of dying, Mr. Fox instead has a subconscious phobia of wolves. The wolf in this theory is the ideal of wild, like it is in the first theory almost, something that Mr. Fox can easily associate with death because of the likelihood that a wolf would kill him and most of the other animals seen in the film. Over time, this phobia has developed into a strange relationship with Mr. Fox, as wolves are as wild as he'd like to think he is, and though their wilderness grants them nothing to lose, while Mr. Fox realises throughout the course of the film that he has everything to lose besides his own life. Through combating his phobia towards the end of the wolf scene, Mr. Fox is faced with an epiphany. Throughout his life he has had to face death because of himself, and has caused many others to risk death because of his own actions. Only through selfless acts of courage to rescue Christopherson and Ash is Mr. Fox redeemed. He cannot keep chasing wilder and wilder adventures because they would lead to more than just his own death. By the end, Mr. Fox is not himself afraid of death, though he does fear others dying. And the wolf's presence in that final moment to me is more of a mutual scene of acknowledgement, wrapping up Mr. Fox's journey throughout the film rather than just existing as a standalone piece. The wolf is entirely black, a colour that often symbolises death, and stands on a cold, snowy hill, again implying the cold embrace of death. It has no need to communicate with Mr. Fox, instead its presence alone reminds him of his own mortality, and how lucky he is to be alive with what he has. This gives us an explanation not only for the appearance of the wolf, but also the emotional weight that the scene carries. This is the final trial Mr. Fox must face in order to transition from trying to recapture his youth to living as a civilised animal. The tear in his eye stems not only from his fear of the situation, but also his recognition of this hopefully being his final brush with death. In a sense, the wolf's salute to Mr. Fox is an official declaration that Mr. Fox won, and that no longer will he deal with Boggis, Bunt, Bean or any other farmer. He sacrificed his wildness, pushed into living into the sewers, but at the end of the day, that's not such a bad thing considering everything Fox and his family have been through. This death theory is maybe a bit too dramatic, and makes the charming fantastic Mr. Fox read more as a Greek tragedy. Yeah, I still think it holds ground. In truth though, I think the wolf scene is meant to have multiple meanings. Nothing has been officially confirmed about the scene in 13 years, and I doubt it ever will. The wolf scene could be Fox's last look at his wild life, him meeting his masculine ideal, or acknowledging the game of cat and mouse he's had with death over his many fox years. Or it could just be none of that. I don't live in Wes Anderson's head, and neither do you. But I hope now that you watch the scene, you'll see more was meant to be read than just a random fox and wolf crossover event. For me, it's the scene that perfectly ends one of my favourite films. Thank you so much for watching. I know the last video I made was more YouTube drama-esque, but at the moment this is very much just a hobby for me, where I pick out something depending on what I can write for like days on end about. If you'd like to see more or less of something, do let me know. All the usual. See you soon. Bye bye.